Back in the day when we were doing our personal assistant and B2C days, I remember we tried this one, and we literally got questions like, when is Katrina Kaif's birthday, right? Because even though we had set the expectation, we're a personal assistant app, this is what we do, and all those things, we left the canvas blank, right? And that's where I think design plays a big role.
Hello and welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. We've spoken plenty about conversational intelligence. Indeed, it is transforming sales and service in every industry possible. Swapan and his founding team at Haptik imagined this reality in 2013, and they've been plugging away at this problem ever since. They've been through more than a couple of pivots, having started off as a consumer app and then transitioning to building bots for businesses. They've had near death situations, as Swapan explains, and through it all, they've hung in there, building away. In 2019, Reliance Jio acquired Haptik, and their ambitions have grown to a whole other level since. Listen to this conversation with Swapan to understand the Haptik story. It's equal parts inspiring and insightful. Hey Swapan, welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Hi Roshan, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here, and look forward to our chat today.
Yeah, so I have followed the haptic journey for quite a while. And I must say, when I first heard of haptic, I think it was 2014, 2015. I thought it was like the Jarvis for common man, right? One app to solve everything, to resolve service issues, to book a cab, recharge my phone, etc., whatever, right? I'm probably missing half a dozen other things that the app did at the time. But you've been through so many changes along the way, and today you're very different from where you started, right? So, to perhaps set the context for this conversation, if you could take us through the founding story of Haptik and the various pivots and milestones along the way, that would be great.
Yeah, no, that definitely, man. And you're absolutely right. I think when I look back at the last, it's been 9 years now. But obviously, since Akrit and I started thinking about it, it's almost been a decade, right? And when I look at this journey, it's been a fascinating one, and obviously, with a lot of kind of different pivots and different pivotal moments in the company, right? But to kind of really kind of share about one thing, right? So I think obviously we have gone through multiple avatars as a company, right? So as you said, right, we were a B2C app at one point. Today actually we are a B2B SaaS company. But at the root of it all, right, and I think I'll this is where obviously the story starts, right? Back in 2011, 2012, right, we definitely saw a problem statement that existed and a trend that was happening, and that we wanted to marry the two, and that vision or that thought has actually remained constant through the journey, right? So let me tell you what it really meant, right? So even back then, and I think it still holds very much true right now, right? Like we saw this problem that whenever any of us as users or consumers, right, when we interact with a company or a brand, right, we realize that experience about how a user and a brand are interacting didn't feel the most smoothest or the best, right? So obviously, and here we're not only talking about customer support, right? While obviously customer support was the biggest thing and probably still is, we always thought about it as an end-to-end customer experience, right? So how do you discover a brand, right? From there, how do you find the products and services that really suit your needs, right? Because a lot of times you have a lot of these questions when you're buying, that how does this work, what does that mean? And then once you buy it, obviously there's post sales help you might need. And the other thing, which is more a brand specific problem, was the recall of the brand, right? Like, hey, if I bought something, how do I remember it again the next time, right? So that experience, we always figured, was not the smoothest and can become a whole lot better, right? And at that point, we started seeing a trend, which was the rise of digital conversations, right? So back in 2011, WhatsApp was obviously just picking up, right? So Akrit used to be in his previous job, looking at a lot of these apps, and he saw that, hey, WhatsApp seeing tremendous traction. But even before that, right, there was BlackBerry Messenger, which took on a lot of steam as well, right? So we saw, like, we as human beings are conversational in nature. There's this rise of the way we are communicating with each other is becoming a lot more digital. So that was really the genesis of this whole thing, right? We're like, can we take this trend that we're seeing of digital conversations and these digital mediums, take this problem statement of customer experience and marry the two to really solve that problem, right? So that's where we started. And essentially we obviously, started similar to where we are today, right? We thought, hey, we'll go to customers, we'll tell them we'll build these experiences for you and they'll just buy it and eat it up, right? And we were so excited. But obviously, we realized very soon that none of them cared. They're like, what are you talking to us about, right? Like, how are you going to build all these things? And it didn't fly at all, right? And that's where, obviously in true survival mode, when you're come up with a concept which you're like, hey, this doesn't work, we're like, what else do we do, right? And that's kind of where we obviously realized B2C was the right way to start, right? So we realized, why don't we create an app, right? Why don't we create an app which will allow us to provide services to our users, right? And these services will probably be, essentially we would be a middleman which will be acting on behalf of these companies or on those kind of layers, right? So that's kind of where we started ideating on, and that was the first kind of big growth of Haptik, where we became a personal assistant for everyone, right? So we were an everyday personal assistant, and exactly the thing you're saying, right? Anything that people would want to do on a day-to-day basis, from reminders to grocery shopping to movie tickets to cabs to what have you, right? Like flights, restaurants, we had it all, right? Because we're like, we want people to be able to get great experiences, and it should be easy, and chat is the medium which we really believed in, right? So obviously that was where we saw big first growth. Some of the, because you asked some of the interesting milestones, right? I think through this B2C journey of ours, right? While obviously that's the case, we raised the round of funding, actually two rounds of funding through the thing, but we've actually been run out of money and almost shut down the company a lot of times, right? So we've run out of money twice for that matter. And I remember both Akrit and I took out, barely any savings we had because we had put it all in Haptik, but we kind of took out some money. I had actually loaned money from a friend to put back in Haptik. And we've always been lucky both those times that we were almost at the tail end of completely dying, but we obviously raised our money, right? So a couple of times we've gone through those really emotional things, and I can go on and on about this, but those have been kind of obviously things. But the good things are the right people took the bets on us, right? Like this chatbots, IVAs, virtual assistants, what we call it today, didn't exist then, and we were one of the first few people really pushing for this, right? So we were really at that point, if you ask me, trying to educate and build a category that, hey guys, this is possible, and this not just possible technology wise, right? It is truly a great experience, right? Like that's kind of what we were doing. Obviously, come 2017, this space boomed, right? I mean, it started catching a lot of traction. All the big guys came into it, Facebook's, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, everyone's in it today, right? With that, the behavior of the market started changing, right? Which is, all enterprises and big brands were like, hey, yes, this is something that's working, yes, this is something that we would want to be on. And that's when we started getting a lot of interest, right? So we started getting enterprises coming to us. They're like, see, I've seen your app, I've seen Haptics consumer app. Can you build a bot for me, right? Can you kind of do it for me on my mobile app? And we were like, sure, not, why not, right? We have the technology. So we had really built out technology because we were building bots for ourselves. We're like, we can just kind of change it to be bots for you and deploy it on your channels and things like that, right? So we started entertaining those requests, and from there we just started seeing a lot of great fit, right? And I think revenue started flowing in, the business model started adding up, we started growing tremendously as a company. And obviously very soon then we stopped our B2C arm and we became a completely B2B SaaS company, right? So that's kind of where we are in a nutshell.
Wow, it's been a roller coaster ride, I must say, right? Take us back to those times, right? I mean, you mentioned a couple of times almost running out of money and so on. I think it's entrepreneurship in general. I think it's a kind of a lonely journey, right? And on top of that, when you're early in a market, when you have this gut conviction that you know what, this is going to happen, but it's not yet happened, right? You tend to persevere a little longer and a little longer, right? But then, I mean, the realities hit you, right? I mean, whether it's like your costs or people or whatever else, what do you kind of tell yourself that time? And what are some of the lessons you've learned along the way?
Yeah. No, man. I mean, absolutely. So I think one of the big things that I always keep thinking about, right? One is exactly, I think having a co-founder is so much better than being a single founder. And I think exactly for one of these reasons, right? Because through this journey, no matter how early or what you are as a founder, right? Because what ends up happening is the buck stops at you, right? So all the problem are yours, all the success, well, success I won't say is always yours, but the failures are definitely yours, right? And when you get to a point where you're like, you know what, I have a team of even 10, 15, 20 people, no matter how big or small it is, right? There are these people who are, working with me, trying to drive a vision that I solely have conviction in, or we have conviction in, and it's not working out. Everyone has questions, right? And you're just like, hey, am I leading people down the wrong way? Am I chasing a pipe dream that will never come true, right? So obviously, having a co-founder helps, right? Because you're two people going through the same thing, and you just hope you don't both go through the downs together. Like, even though the company is going through it, the other person kind of manages, right? But if I was to look deep down inside, right, I think the biggest thing here, what do you tell yourself, right? I think there are times when you do a company and you start a company to really kind of make a lot of money, right? So you're like, hey, I'm going to do this because it's going to become a $1 billion company, and this is the idea and all of that. And there are times I have thought, right, that hey, I'm doing some of this because I think I can make a lot of wealth, right? But that I've realized, whenever I've thought through that lens, you never succeed, right? Like, you should never be thinking about money, because at a certain point you're like, this is not worth it, man. Like, this stuff is not worth any of it, right? I think what really the true sense is, exactly deep down inside, you're like, the conviction needs to be true. Like, you really really have to believe in what you're doing. And I don't believe, I'm not saying believe in the business model today, or believe in what the product is today, right? You have to believe in a world that you imagine 3 5 years down the line, right? And I think unless you just believe in that very very thoroughly, you're not going to be able to get through, right? And that's kind of when a lot of times you lose, right? And I'll be honest with you, I think we have thought multiple times of shutting down Haptik, right? And in fact, some very early on, some very late on, right? Like, even after seeing over a couple of million users on our app, you still question it, right? Because you're like, hey, is this really working, right? Is this like something, will anyone's life change if I shut down today, right? And I think those questions are existential questions, always realize. So the idea is always, always thinking about and having conviction in the world that you believe, what you believe the world is going to be 5 years from now, right? And I think the minute you look at that, the minute you have a co-founder you can talk to about, right? If not a co-founder, a panel of maybe mentors or advisors who you can just talk to, I think that just makes a hell of a difference, right? So, my only thought is, I think, having a co-founder obviously got me a lot through this journey. And obviously, number two, truly thinking about where we would be sitting 5 years hence. And, luckily we are sitting there where everyone is using chatbots. Easier said now, but always believe this was where we would want the world to be. And that's just the motivation that kept us going.
Awesome. Yeah. Certainly helps to have another person in the journey for sure. You started out in the consumer space and now you operate in the enterprise. And these are two very, very different worlds. Right. So, from a product perspective, what are some of the key similarities that you observe and what are some of the differences?
Yeah. So, great question, right? I think, see, there are a couple of things, right? There are a few fundamental aspects of obviously product management which remain the same regardless, right? So, obviously, before actually going to product, let me talk about this, right? I think the big thing, similarity, which regardless of a product that you're building, is distribution, right? Like, you really have to think about how are you going to get your distribution. And what really becomes is the messaging, right? Which is, how are you positioning, right? So it's always been expectations versus reality. In the consumer space, we would have our website, but we would be running ads. We would have our Play Store and App Store pages where people would land. All of those places, the messages you send, right? That what do you do as an app? What do you do as a product? Versus when a person actually comes into the product, do you meet those expectations, right? So the distribution first, how are you building your distribution networks, and the messaging, which is expectation versus reality that a user comes with, are fundamental to whatever you're building, right? So if a user wants something and you're building that, you're positioning it the right way, you're able to kind of get the right outcomes, right? So fundamentals of product management, which is all of those, are fairly same, right? But what becomes interesting is there are a few subtle aspects as well which become fairly different. One is, in the consumer space, you can't really talk to your users that easily, right? Versus in an enterprise space, you can talk to your customers a lot because you're directly selling to them, right? Like you're not playing the bulk game of millions and millions of customers, right? You're selling and you're doing all that. So with that fundamental difference, right? With the users bulk not able to talk to them much, so the feedback loops need to be a lot of fully analytics driven, right? That you look at your analytics, you look at all of those numbers, and you're trying to really get that feedback in there. But at the same time, your feedback loops are smaller, right? Like you can release something and you'll see usage and you'll able to kind of convict get something whether it's working or not, right? So I think that is one thing on the B2C aspect. On the B2B aspect, it's a little different, right? Here you have to actually enable people to position you, right? So my salespeople today, I have to ensure they are able to understand my product, because I'm not only distributing it through digital means, there are people talking to people, right? So are the salespeople able to really provide the true power of the platform or the product you're building? But at the same time, they get great feedback, right? So you're able to kind of relay that very well. But whatever you take and whatever you build, the cycle of validating some of it is longer, right? Because your sales cycles are longer and some of those things, right? So I think there's a feedback loop mechanism which is absolutely important. There are fundamental differences there. How you get the feedback and how you incorporate the feedback, how you test the feedback, right? Secondly, in the consumer space, obviously, consumer and users are very unforgiving, right? So you have to focus on a few things, and the initial few journeys that are gone, you've lost the guy, right? Like, I mean, it's very hard to get the person back. In the enterprise space, I won't say they're less forgiving, or something on those lines, but it's at least easier to maintain and build that relationship and get them back, right? Because in the end, in an enterprise SaaS, it's you're selling to people, right? And when you build a good relationship, you can always tell them to give you one more chance, tell them to kind of do a lot of that. So the products are a lot more complex, I would say, in the B2B part, because they're confusing, but you can get a couple of shots. On the user side, it's obviously a lot more trickier, right? So those are some of the high level ones I can think about. There are obviously a lot of difference in product management processes, right? Like in B2B, you have to care a lot about the go to market, right? Which is how are you taking it to market, your positioning, your sales enablement, your regular updates on your website, because you're showing all your features on your websites, you're showing all your features on your one pagers and all of that stuff. Versus on the B2B side, it's more user onboarding journeys that a person comes in. How do you kind of onboard them? How do you make them discover your pop ups to catch attention and all that stuff? So I think different kinds of processes to get your adoptions right, but fundamentals of it obviously remains the same.
Right, interesting. One of the things that I always thought was a bit of a puzzle was in that in the enterprise, I think the user and the buyer may be different. So, who do you prioritize and at what point of time, right? And how do you really draw that straight line between building for the user and also building for the business case as well? That becomes a little interesting, I feel.
Yeah. No, that's a great point, man. And exactly right. I think in the B2B space, if the user and the buyer different, and obviously in the decision making, there are 10 different people who can come in, right? There is
Yeah.
a influencer, and then there is, someone who is the decision maker, and then there's another one who's a user, and then there's another one who's that. So you're right. I mean, the personas you sell to in B2B are drastically more than in the
Yeah, way
B2C.
more complex.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So the broader category in which you operate is called conversational intelligence, and it's a very complex problem that you solve. Right, oftentimes you're dealing with very unstructured information or data, and then you're solving for very specific goals. Right, I mean, people are not chatting for chatting per se. Right, I mean, they're trying to solve a specific goal and get to some place. Right, so could you give us some insights into what are the typical challenges like, and how do you solve them?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you're right, right? I mean, I'll give you one quick insight on this, right? Which is, I think users and, because we've been through the B2C and the B2B journeys for that matter, right? It's a very interesting play, which I would say is between technology and design, right? And I think that's a very important thing to think about, right? We had actually tried this back in our B2C days, whereas when someone comes on a chat screen, right, and you just keep it empty, you've kept the canvas completely empty, right, and open. So the users will come and talk about anything and everything that's on their mind, right? So at that point, they will just come and say anything, right? So I'll back in the day when we were doing our personal assistant and B2C days, I remember we tried this one, and we literally got questions like, when is Katrina Kaif's birthday, right? Because even though we had set the expectation, we're a personal assistant app, this is what we do and all those things, we left the canvas blank, right? And that's where I think design plays a big role, right? It's when a user enters, have you set the context of what you want the user to talk about, right? What is it that you can help the user with, what is it that you cannot help the user with, right? So there is a very big part of design, and the reason that is important, right, is because then on a technology level you're not trying to solve all the problems of the world, right? So if you ask me, exactly, there are enough AI ML companies trying to solve what we call the generic AI problem, right, which is a user can come ask you anything and you have that conversation. And there where you the measure of success there is what they call as turns per conversation, right? How many back and forths I can have with you without you getting bored or leaving me, right? That's the generic AI problem. But see, we don't solve that problem, right? Like that's not the problem I want to solve. And honestly, I think that problem is going to take a little while to even get there, right? Like I don't think we are there yet as a technology company world for that matter. So the way we think about it, right? Exactly, we are here where we want people to talk about particular aspects that we can do for them, right? So the first part is how do you solve that problem? How do you set that expectation? Secondly, you want to think about the domain you are in, right? Because as you said, the languages we speak in are actually very, very complex, right? Like English language, right? I mean, like when you get deeper into it, and that's what I used to never think about it, but the word book, right? Just the context you're talking about it could mean different things, right? Like you can imagine I'm on an e-commerce website, or I want to book something, right? You can buy a book, right, at the same time, versus if you're on a restaurant's website, you want to book a table, right? So multiple meanings of the same thing. So the other thing is domain specificity, right, which is you have to the context you are setting, the domain you are in, how do you build technology to understand that domain versus just keep it fully generic? I think the minute you start thinking from that lens, you're able to kind of really focus on the problem statements you're trying to solve, right? So in a nutshell, the way I think about it is it's a combination of design and technology. I think it's a combination of focusing on the problem statements you want to solve, and then at the end of the day, technology deep down inside, that's what we use, right? Like we try to stay at the cutting edge or trying to push the boundaries with obviously using all the latest technologies like deep learning models and all those things, right? But in the end, all of that, if you don't have a goal in mind or the problem statement sort of focus statement, you'll end up easily wandering around and not solve the problem, right? So essentially my thought there is solve it using technology design with this, really narrow down on the problem statement you want to solve, and then really go deep in that problem statement to give the best experience, right? Like I think that's kind of the way I would think about it.
Right. And the context is different in different domains and functions, right? And the thing about conversational intelligence is that it's applicable across these different functions and domains,
Yes.
whether it's sales or service, whether it's hospitality or financial services, and so on. And oftentimes, when you're building a horizontal solution, meaningfully productizing the last mile for these specific use cases is a huge challenge, especially in your case where you have to be context aware also, right?
Yes.
So, how do you think about that problem?
Yeah. No, great question, man. And I'll tell you how I think about this whole thing, right? So think about it as a three-layered problem, right? And if I think about this conversational AI, and I'm going a little deep into the technology aspect because I think that's how we do kind of think about it, right? See, at the base layer, it's the language understanding, right? So as I said, which is you have to understand the language you are conversing in, right? So as I said, understanding all the different subjects, pronouns, adjectives, how they relate to each other, the structure of the language, right? So think about that as the base understanding layer. And you can also think about it is how any baby grows up, and when they start thinking, right, they start picking up words, right? You start understanding what those words are, then you start relating what those words mean to each other, and then you start combining those words to understand how sentences are formed, right? That's the understanding of the language, right? So that's layer one if I were to look at it. Then you come into layer two, right, which is what I said is the domain specificity of this whole thing, right? Which is, you can't only build your language models just to understand generic language, right? You have to then bring in domain specific data to understand context of those domains, right? So as I said, if I've trained my NLU model on top of after the language in a restaurant booking use case, the book meaning I want to reserve, right? Book and reserve is a synonym for that matter. Versus if I am on Amazon's website, a book would mean like a novel or something like that, right? So you kind of build those structures of domain understanding on top of your language understanding, right? So essentially you're building the second layer of understanding, which is very domain specific. And then there's a third layer, right, which is then brand specific, right? So you can't really only think about these two because these are still fairly generic. You when you're solving a problem for a particular brand, right, there are a lot of, let's say, simple things, right, like pronouns, right, like if I think about that, right, now the people, the way they name some of their brand names, right, sometimes they're proper nouns, but sometimes they're also generic words, right? So if I'm giving you Geo Health Hub, right, so if you think about it, that's a product that we kind of build, but the words health hub are very generic, right? Now, exactly, right, like we need to understand in this particular company, this actually is a product, and this does not mean a random generic word for that matter. So the third layer is brand specificity, right, which is how are we understanding the brand, their persona, their products, and how do we kind of really do it. And if you think about it, after that only can you really deliver these experiences. So we've kind of thought of it from that angle, we've built it out in that manner, and that's kind of how we approach, how we build out a lot of these things.
Right. And the use cases itself have evolved a fair bit, right? I mean, I think early days, people thought that, okay, this conversational intelligence thing can perhaps help me do a little bit of cost center optimization or automation, sorry, right? Where you can understand a few basic things about your ticket reservation and so on and so forth. But today, I mean, people are actually expecting delight, right? Which is that, can you manage a personalized, omni-channel experience for my customer, right? Now that's a vastly different problem, right? So how have you seen the expectations evolve in the time that you've been doing this?
Great question, man. And I actually think I'll tell you my personal opinion as well. More than people changing expectation, I think at least for Haptik, we are pushing that expectation, right? I mean, if you ask me. So I'll tell you why, right? I actually think that's a good thing, because if I'll go back to what I said, right? Like when we think about customer experience, right? Like you have to think about the whole journey. And what had ended up happening is customer support was where this whole space started, right? Which is, hey, let's think of it as customer support, because that industry obviously was a lot more, if you ask me, poised for this kind of disruption, because it's like, hey, people are anyways calling me, there are long wait times, I cannot scale this thing. So everyone looked at it as a scaling cost saving mechanism. And the problem there was, right, and at least that's why we are pushing a very different narrative. The problem there was, when you look at something as a cost saving narrative, right, if your North Star metric is cost saving, you will force fit technology, or you will do things that probably scale but don't give the great best experience, right? So we saw a lot of places where, just because it was a cost center optimization project, the end customer experience was actually getting worse. And that, at least to us, right, given where we started and what our true vision and value we want to bring through this thing, we thought that is actually taking the industry in the wrong direction, right? Because eventually people are going to see through all of this. Eventually customers and brands are going to be like, guys, sure, you have saved me $1 million, but my repeat users have gone down by, like, 20%, and I've lost revenue because of all of this, right? So you don't want that happening, right? So in fact, for us, we believe that narrative actually is a much better narrative, because as long as you're thinking about customer experience, you have to think of the whole journey, right? How have you acquired this guy, right? So are you acquiring them at the right place in the right time? How do they convert? How do they discover your products? How do they understand what they need, and are they able to get all their answers to buy that product? Then comes support, and then comes retention, right? Which is then you kind of give them offers and all that stuff. So to kind of go back to your question, I think while people are asking that, I actually, and Haptic, we have pushed for that, and we believe that's the better thing for this industry, right? Because eventually cost savings will happen as a side impact of it, but people will not build for cost savings and really hinder the customer experience. So yeah, man, I mean, I think that's a good thing. And we have obviously, we're excited that you're asking me this question, because exactly that trend is happening, and we believe that's the right trend.
Right. With the newer developments on NLP and AI, what are some of the other use cases that are emerging? What's the funkiest use case that you've seen?
Funkiest use case. Oh, so I'll tell you, there was this one company we were partnering up, which I truly believe, I mean, believe I loved it. And I think, obviously the world we are living in today obviously is seeing a lot of these things, right? So this was 2 years ago. And I'll tell you why I'm talking about that, because it seems a lot more normal now. We were talking to this company, which was a fantastic company. What they did was, on the web, they were building digital avatars, right? So you literally had an avatar of a person or of something like that, and they were actually beautiful, right? Like you would render them on your browser and you would see it, and it looked really really nice, right? So it was actually very pleasing, as you said, right? Like there was a lot of delight in that. We were trying to work with them to power and make that avatar conversational in nature, right? So really kind of, hey, making that happen. This was obviously 2 years ago, and we actually went in, we built out a POC and all that. Obviously, that company went through other things, but that happened, right? I think today, right? I mean, with metaverse coming around, I think this is going to become more normal, right? We are going to have our avatars, which we will be talking to. I think they will be brand with their avatars, and they will be talking. And at a certain point, we're talking about, let's say, humans and these humanoids and machines just conversing in this metaverse of ours, and living in a cohesive world, which is a virtual plus physical being sitting behind a screen world, right? So I think it's becoming more real now, right? Like if you ask me, all big companies are betting on the metaverse, and you can see a lot of that. So I think in our space, I'm excited about that. I think I see us going down that direction. And if I was to extend that, obviously AR VR, big kind of pushes going on there. And you know what that means, we'll see. But exactly, metaverse, AR VR comes through. But I think a little bit more short term, right? I actually think exactly that video. And let's say the world we also live in, right? Like we are a lot on video. If you look at the trends of people consuming video content, it's becoming a lot higher, right? I believe this, it will start with video shopping, video content being more digital but interactive at scale, right? And if you think about it, rather than just one-on-one sales assistance you getting, what if you had like that avatar kind of thing that I was talking about, right? Talking to you, changing your screen, showing you a dress, eventually showing how you look in that dress or in that t-shirt, is starting to become interesting, right? So I think this whole world is going to be very interesting. And I'm excited because we're poised in a good place where we're going to make whatever the humanoids come in there more conversational in nature, and that's what's going to happen. So high
Amazing.
level random things, but I'll tell you a couple of other things I keep getting excited about, right? So this is obviously one interesting space I talk a lot about. I think eventually, right, not today, but there's a big push in self-learning systems, right? And exactly, like you want these systems who are conversing to be able to learn on their own. There are a lot of challenges there because it's very easy to bias a self-learning system, right? We've seen enough stories where big companies have put self-learning bots, and then they've become biased and became, let's say, went down very thin paths, which kind of they had to shut it down because of that, right? So it's an interesting problem, which is a self-learning problem. I think for this space to really get to that, really what we're talking about, the futuristic Jarvis kind of model, some of the self-learning aspects is going to play a big part. So yeah, man, I mean, those are some interesting things. I have a big thought on analytics and insights and all that, but those are more tactical in nature.
Amazing. So you're as passionate about people and culture as you are about technology. So let me ask you this: how do you build a kick-ass culture in this post-COVID remote world that we're living in, where there is literally no osmosis, right? I mean, you don't meet people and so on. How do you do this?
Yeah, man, it's something that I agree with you, right? I mean, it's a very very hard problem, and I think the thing that fears me, I think, is we're still seeing the tip of the iceberg. I think the repercussions of a lot of this aspects are going to come in the future. And that's a problem statement I and we think about a lot, right? I mean, culture is crucial to anything that happens, right? So see, I'll tell you some of the things I think are absolutely important, and what we're kind of doing, right? Which is, one thing, if you think about when you're trying to look at the physical world, when you were with each other and doing all of that, I think the non-transactional conversations were a lot, right? And I'm not only talking about, people obviously think about the water cooler conversations as ideations and ideas coming around. I'm not even talking about those, right? I'm really talking about just talking to someone about a random thought in your mind or something that happened, right? Like, hey, oh, did you know this thing happened? Or did you know, hey, this person just slipped and fell, right? And I think that those small talk conversations have a big impact on our relationship, our mindset about just thinking transactional, right? And I think the
Big
big
time.
challenge is we're becoming very, very transactional in this remote first world, right?
Yeah, I
So
mean that's something that I have thought of as well, right? And I've tried to mend my ways in all my digital communication, which is that if you were to approach someone in the office, right? I mean, you won't just say, "Hey, pass me that file."
Yeah.
right? You'll
You,
probably
you
say, hey,
can,
had lunch, or how's your family doing, etc., or kya yaar, kaisa hai,
right.
all of that stuff, right? I mean, that over Slack, or over Zoom, or etc. I mean, it's just, hey, pass me that file,
Yeah,
you
and
know
exactly. It's so transactional, right? And
yeah.
and I see it, right? Because I see the reason why. Because see, we're also in this now wired in mode the whole time. You're just like, hey, I need to finish this. I need to get to the next thing. I need to guess thing, right? So in
And
this,
get to the 15th Zoom call for the day, basically.
exactly, right? You're running from Zoom call to Zoom call, and you're just like, hey, I just need to wrap everything up and move on to the next one. So we're all becoming transactional, right? And I think it's going to be very, very hard for it to become natural to not be transactional in a digital world, right? So I think that's where leaders of a company need to really kind of think about it, right? It has to be a top down approach, right? So certain things that we obviously try to do, right? I mean, slowly, not slowly, but now I know at Haptik, you can't do this at a company scale. So not everything can be done at, everyone needs to do all of this together, but you have to build those micro cultures, right? So the idea is, I've spoken to a lot of the leaders saying that, hey, you know what, every week have X amount of time where you're just having some, chit chat time, get a grab a coffee, play a game, do that. Like genuinely put the agenda as nothing, right? Like no work talk, right? Secondly, there's this concept of at least, when at a leadership level, which is virtual coffees, right? Which is, hey, you know what? I don't get to interact with you at a lot of different times. I would have walked by your desk and said hi, and you would have seen some of your leaders and interacted with them. But in this case, block out certain times in your calendar to have virtual coffees, right? So I think that becomes the second one. The third one, which, obviously we're very clear on, is I don't, you have to meet in person every once in a while, right? And as a company, while everyone's talking about remote work being cost saving, I actually don't even look at it as a cost saving mechanism, right? I look at it as a convenience for people, and the people you can get become one world. But you have to meet every frequently, right? So we are telling people that, hey, every couple of months the teams come together. We are keeping our office, that's one place you can meet. If not, you can meet in other cities. Obviously the travel and all is all reimbursed by work, because without that, it won't work, right? So I think obviously those are certain things we're doing. Apart from that, yeah, standard, right? Our HR team, obviously we keep occasions, so there'll be virtual events and all those things which we keep doing. But I think some of these bigger aspects of meeting in person, having regular touch bases as a microculture team. Oh, another thing that we did which worked out fairly well, we built out social communities at work, right? So we have a book club now at work, we have a music club at work, we have a Wordle club at work, which is people sharing their Wordle wins every day and those kind of things. So micro cultures, micro communities, meeting every once in a while, even if those communities want to meet more than anything else. So sponsoring those communities to kind of encourage doing a lot of that. I think those are the ways forward to essentially build some of this in your culture.
Right. Great set of ideas. 2019 was a milestone year for you, right? I mean, Reliance Jio acquired Haptik. You're now part of a larger organization, and we're seeing that the Jio juggernaut is kind of rolling on, right? Especially over the last 2-3 years.
Yeah.
How have your ambitions changed post the Jio acquisition, and what does it feel like to be part of a larger vision and a larger goal?
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, obviously, 2019 that happened, and obviously, been 3 years now, and it's been absolutely fantastic, right? And then exactly so, as you said, right, the geo vision, the geo ambitions, we all know, they are massive, right? And I think what ends up happening, which is what I think is great, right? Being part of the Reliance ecosystem, we've realized what we used to think big is not even big, right? Like we have to think bigger than what we even used to think.
Yeah.
So I think
You now have to think Reliance big.
exactly, right. And even for, let's say, even for a company like us, when they acquired us, they encouraged us to think Reliance big, right? They're like, see, don't think this, don't think that, right? Like at this point, that's one of the best things, right? Like we're not thinking survival anymore, we're not thinking next round of funding anymore, right? We are thinking what's that big impact we can make, how can we become that billion-dollar company, right? Like we're really thinking those things. So I think the Reliance, being part of the Reliance ecosystem, really introduces you to a scale, and I honestly, I actually also think, how do you operate at that scale in a very different manner, right? And it's absolutely amazing, right? I mean, I can tell you this, they are still, and that's what I realized, right? They, as in Geo overall, and even us, right? Even Geo as a whole thing is still very, very agile, right? Like I've seen things turn around in days, and I was not expecting that, right? I was like, oh, that's amazing, and that kind of encourage you that, hey, you know what? As we also grow bigger, right? We should always realize the impact and the time to market impact, right? Like you shouldn't just be like, hey, I'll take my own sweet time to get to this, right? Like always reinventing yourself, always pushing the limit. So that's been actually fairly good. And obviously, we have been introduced to the companies in the world which we could have never imagined, right? Obviously, with the funding that Geo got, I think it opened doors for us, which really kind of help us, exactly spread our arms a lot more wider than we would have been able to anymore. So I think our ambitions have gone higher. I think, if you ask me, it's become bigger than what we were thinking. So that's a good thing. And being part of this larger ecosystem, as I said, right, I think it's set up really well where Haptik still today is operationally independent, right? So the way it works is, we're really, as founders, being given the mantle that, hey, you need to make this big, but it is your vision, it is your execution that is going to get you there, right? And we are here to kind of support you whatever you need. So in the end, operationally, how we want to direct the company, where we want to get it, what are the KPIs we want to move, what products do we want to launch, is still fairly with us, right? So that kind of really gives us a very good framework of what we want to do, but also a foundation of where we want to do, right? So I think overall that's been really good. And being part of the Reliance ecosystem, we have learned a lot from there. We've realized how big companies operate. We've understood how you can get things done at that scale, and really what impact should be thought of, right? We all know the Geo story of how they have created a massive business for that matter, right? So I can tell you this, I think about this a lot. And obviously, when we were going through this acquisition, both Akrit and I thought about this a lot. But I think overall the journey has been fantastic. It doesn't feel any different from us before Reliance, except the fact that we just have a foundation to think and grow a lot faster and bigger at this point.
Yeah. No, I think the geo revolution is something that we speak about often in the podcast. And maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 years down the line, when we look back, I mean, we will kind of think of this as one of those key moments in India's history, really. The amount of markets it's opened up, where today, I mean, we are seeing, one of the highest data consumption on a monthly basis, right? At the lowest prices as well. So, which is phenomenal. And it's great that Haptik is part of this journey as well.
Yeah,
So,
no, absolutely.
to yeah. So towards the end, we ask all entrepreneurs that we have on the podcast that, knowing what you know about this space, right? And having operated in the space, obviously you're privy to some of these secrets and some of these insights that is only revealed through hardcore execution in this space, right? So for an entrepreneur who's looking to build a conversational intelligence solution, what are those two or three insights that could set them on the right path?
No, perfect. Absolutely right. So, see, I think overall, I'll tell you of, as I said, right, a few things that you kind of have to think about, right? See, my core belief on this whole thing, right, which is, and this might be a little generic, but I'll get into the how do you win in this space for that matter, right? I think it really starts with a problem statement. And a lot of times, a lot of us, what the mistakes we do, right? And I think I've done personally some of that, which is, you think that there is a technology that is really good, right? So let's say conversational AI, chatbots, or even AI for that matter, right? Like it's obviously trending, it's a buzzword today that everyone talks about. But when you try to take a technology first and then think about a business, it never leads to any right outcomes, right?
Yeah.
And I've done this mistake plenty of times. And I've, even recently, right, I'm like, oh, this sounds like a great thing to do because this technology can change so many things. But we build technology first and then try to see what problem it solves, right? It
It's like a hammer in search of a nail, basically.
Exactly, right, which is exactly the problem. And I think that absolutely needs to be changed, right? So exactly now, conversational AI, right? I think you mentioned this earlier, right? It's possible to use conversational AI anywhere and everywhere, right? Like I can tell you, you name a segment in this industry on this world today, and I can tell you how a chatbot can play a role, right? And exactly, right? We have done it all. We have done movie tickets bookings through bots. We have done restaurant reservations through bots. We have done customer support through bots. We have done it all, right? I think the important thing to really realize is what is that problem you want to solve, because it needs to start there. And then really think about, are conversations required to solve this problem, right? So I think there is a simple thing that happens today, right? People are like, hey, I have a website, I want a bot that whatever my website can do, I want the bot to do, right? But why, right? Like that shouldn't be the way it should work, right? You have to think about what is the problem with your website today, right? Like what is not happening. Is it that your website has a lot of different pages and navigating through your website is a problem? And if that's the problem, yes, is conversations the right way to solve it? And at that point I would say yes, right? Because you have a thought in your mind that, hey, I want to get to this part of the website, I should be able to type it somewhere, search it, and have a conversation and probably get it there, right? So my main advice would be, in conversational AI, it's very, very easy to use conversational AI for anything and everything, right? And as I told you, it's very possible as well for that matter. It needs to be flipped, right? Find what the problem is, what is really the problem that we need to solve, and think about, is this problem a conversational problem, right? Do I need to talk? Do I need to put my thoughts in a very unstructured manner in some place to get a result back? And if that's the case, then really go and solve that problem, which will then lead you in this space of conversational AI and get you that direction. So at least that's my thought process in this space. Find the problem, make sure it is a conversational solution to solve it, because I've seen people force fit conversations places where you don't need to do conversation, right? Like sometimes, hey, your mobile app and websites are good enough to do it, because in fact there's more real estate there than you might even get in a conversational screen for that matter, right? So think through that and then dig deeper into it. I think once you get into it, the journey will follow.
No, it's a great point. So, Swapan, before we let you go, any books or podcasts that you would recommend to our audience?
Yeah, so off late, by the way, at least over the last year, I have stopped reading self-help books, because I've realized a lot of those books can be blog posts, and I know that's the thing, but I just realized, I want to read for the fun of reading. I don't want to read every time just to learn, right? Like I think there are times I want to just sit back, read a book, and just enjoy it like you would enjoy a TV show or something. So I'll give both. One book which I think was very, very relevant, which helped me in my career a lot. Another one, I'll give one of these fun fiction books that I like to think about, which is my favorite. And I'll recommend a blog, a podcast, which obviously I think I've followed a lot of late, right? So the book I think that really kind of helped me become a better leader was The Hard Things About Hard Things, by Norwitz. I think it gave me very subtle things which I realized as a leader I should not do. And it's not just, hey, build this business or think about this, right? What you realize, building a company depends on the people who are you're building it with, right? And it's given me so many aspects of how to work with people, how to set up a company where people will enjoy working, and all of those things, right? Like I'll give you a simple thing that I have followed ever since I read that book. Obviously multiple things, that one that really stuck with me, I used to not do one-on-ones with a lot of people that used to report into me before that, right? Like I used to just be like, hey, we're working, we'll just sit, we'll work, we'll talk work and all that. And one of the things we talk about, the remote world and the transactional stuff, right? It Sure, in the physical world also you can have that chit chat, but a one-on-one really takes you away from day to day talking about some of the larger aspects which relate to both the people, right? Like what does the person want to do, what are your aspirations, what are the challenges, how can I help you? And for me, how do I get feedback, how do I learn where the other person is, how do I grow as a leader, and how do we kind of work with each other a lot more beautifully, right? So that was one lesson I learned from there, which ever since then I have ensured I don't do repeat that mistake. And I can tell you, I think it's led to a lot less attrition, if nothing else, I can tell you that. So that was one book, obviously many other lessons in there, so I would highly recommend that book. A fiction book that I absolutely enjoy is A Gentleman in Moscow. I don't know if anyone's read it, but it's by Amor Towles. A delight to read, right? I mean, the main character in there is like a true, a person you'd be like, hey, this is the kind of guy people want to be like. But fantastic story, so I would highly, highly recommend it. I've actually gifted this book to multiple people just because I was like, I want that joy of reading to other people as well. So that's the other book I would put on a fiction. And I think on blogs, on podcasts, I don't listen to a lot, but there is one that I have gotten fairly deep into is Tim Ferriss's podcast, Farnham Street. I think his obviously is just a holistic podcast. You learn about so many different things. I think it just broadens your horizon as a human being, and I truly enjoy his podcasts a lot. Right. So yeah, I think that's my answer to the three things.
Awesome. So, Swapan, this was a fascinating conversation. I think we spoke about a lot of nuances that are very, very relevant in your space, and I'm sure that our audience would find this super insightful. Thank you again for making time for this, and all the best with everything that you have coming up.
Thank you, Roshan, and thank you for having me. And I was also going to mention your podcast in this list, but I thought that but no, man. I mean, fantastic job here. I pleasure being on this podcast, and I look forward to a lot more conversation.
Thank you so much, Swapan.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, then don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite platform and share this episode with all of your fellow startup operators. Also, follow the Startup Operator on LinkedIn and Twitter for more updates. Stay safe, take care, and see you soon on a brand new episode of the Startup Operator.